Welcome to episode 10 of Ryan's Shooting Podcast, where today we're going to be covering the third main part of the mental game shooting. But before we get started on that, though, I'd like to say a big thank you to those of you who have donated to support the show. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad to see that you're finding what I put out to be useful and worthwhile. If you would like to donate, it's very simple to do. Just head over to paypal.me/Ryan's Shooting Podcast with no spaces or punctuation and enter the amount you would like to send. All you need is a PayPal account, which is very easy and free if you don't have one. Thanks so much. Okay, so here it is, Mental Game 101 Part 3. So far, we've covered the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, and we've got a pretty good start on how to use them right away in our shooting, how to develop those aspects of our mental game over time, and hopefully you're starting to realize what a big part of your continued and future success in the sport this mental game thing makes up. So, how about we finish up this intro series on the mental game and get on to the last part, the self-image. Self-image. This is the way you see yourself. What you perceive your attitudes to be, the level of your skills, your abilities, how you feel you act under certain scenarios, and when it comes to your shooting, it's what you perceive your current skill and score level to be. The self-image is at its most basic point kind of based on what your core values are or what you decide to make them. For instance, someone who bases their values someone who bases their actions on being competitive and doing whatever it takes to be the best at whatever they do might behave differently from someone who bases all of their actions on trying to lift other people up and helping others achieve their goals. These two people are going to behave completely different in everyday life activities as well as in their shooting, and this isn't to say that someone's core values can't be a combination of these types of things or that one is necessarily better than the other. It's just an example to try and illustrate the differences of how different core values will lead people to behave differently, and it'll lead them to think of themselves differently as well. But this show is centered around the shooting sports, so let's focus on exactly how self-image is related to your shooting. Let's consider for a moment two shooters. These two shooters have almost everything in common. They've both been shooting for about the same amount of time, they both have equivalent equipment and match experience. They've developed the same amount of subconscious technical skill, and they both have found ways to be disciplined and efficient when it comes to their conscious thoughts while shooting. And they both have pretty similar scores in practice. So you would think that these two would normally be neck and neck when it comes to match day, right? Each will beat the other about half the time, and on any given day, it'd be pretty much impossible to determine beforehand who the winner would be. However, in reality, Shooter 1 beats Shooter 2 about 80% of the time. So how can that be, and what's the reason for it? Well, this does happen in real life, doesn't it? I mean, we've all seen it. Maybe not quite as exacting and scientific as the scenario I've described above, but maybe it's that somebody who's younger or less experienced commonly shoots as well or better than someone who's been shooting longer. Now, there are, of course, a few reasons for why this could be, including things like differences in just pure joy of the sport, or maybe one had better coaching than the other, or better dedication to practice, different levels of competitiveness, or the desire to win. But even among people who are similar in these regards, it's not uncommon for the less experienced shooter to beat the more experienced one. And I know partly because I've been this less experienced person a fair amount in my own shooting career. The difference here, and the cause for this phenomenon, most likely has to do with differences in self-image. Remember how during last week's episode on the subconscious mind, I mentioned how while the subconscious is where your skills are and developing it deeply will make you a better shooter, or maybe somebody who is more likely to shoot better shots more frequently, that it's not necessarily going to make you a better competitor. Remember that? Well, this is because if you ask me, what kind of competitor you are is driven almost entirely by your self-image, especially when you're looking at two shooters with very different technical ability, with very similar technical ability. So given that, here is a very important principle. The self-image is what drives you to compete at a certain level. If you have a big self-image, you have a much higher likelihood of performing better than someone with a low self-image. That makes sense, right? If you have two shooters of equal ability, one who says, I'm a great shooter, I'm going to perform well today because it's like me to perform well under the stress of competition, versus another shooter who says, I always struggle in competition, I'm never able to shoot as well as I do in practice, and today probably isn't going to be that much different. Well, who do you think is going to win? I'll give you a hint. The first one is almost definitely going to win unless something weird happens, like a gun breaks or they crossfire or something like that. But I mean, I bet your farm against my farm that the first guy is going to win just because of his self-image. The self-image gives you a kind of comfort zone, if you will, when it comes to your shooting. So, tell me if you've ever personally experienced either of the two following scenarios. Scenario number one. You start out a match and it's really not going well. Shot after shot, just poor outcomes, right? Low scores. Maybe the first few strings are quite a bit lower than what you expect out of yourself compared to what you normally shoot, but then, almost like magic, the rest of the match goes better and, better than normal, and you end up with a score at the end of the day that is pretty close to what you're used to. Have you ever had that happen? Scenario 2. It's kind of like the inverse of scenario 1. You start out great, fantastic, better than normal. Then towards the end of the match, you fall off, maybe just all at once in the last string. And it takes you down from what was going to be a personal best or a really good score, or maybe just, break over a score goal that you had set. But, you fall off at the end and it puts you right back down again to where you normally shoot. Or, I guess here's the third shorter scenario. You shoot a single shot that is uncommonly low. Say you shoot a 7 and you practically never shoot anything lower than a 9. It's not going to be surprising to me that right after that shot you follow it up with a nice long string of 10s. Now these scenarios are all extremely common, and the reason for it is that your performance is directly dictated by your self-image. Your self-image, sitting there kind of in the background, has a picture of where it sees you as a shooter. It basically says to itself, I normally shoot between score X and score Y, and it does everything it can to put your performance between those two values. Now, those things might not be literal numerical scores. They're probably more like, they're probably more like outcome-based performance standards. But nonetheless, they normally output a numerical outcome between two generic values. Normally you're going to shoot between X and Y. So your self-image is doing everything it can to keep you in its comfort zone, its expected range. Now keep in mind that this is not necessarily where you as a shooter want to end up score-wise. What you want to accomplish and what your self-image drives you to accomplish are two completely separate things. And as long as they're not aligned, you're not going to be getting what you want. By the way, this goes not just for shooting. If you're, say, a college student who wants to get all A's, do you think you're going to be able to get them if your self-image doesn't see you as a person who normally achieves that standard? The answer is no, or at least probably not, and at least not on a consistent basis. That's why you see tons of C students who are like, yeah, I want to get A's, but they never do. But what they require the most is a change of self-image. Same thing goes for shooting. The logical conclusion here that all this discussion has led us to, what it should be is that in order to become a better competitor and someone who shoots higher scores, especially in competition, I must first change my self-image to that of a person who regularly accomplishes what it is I want to accomplish. You can't just sit back and assume that you're going to reach a level of performance that you want if your current self-image is below that. Oh, but Ryan, how am I supposed to see myself as someone who performs differently than I do? Well, to answer this, I give you another critical principle regarding the self-image. The self-image is directly influenced by your self-talk and the things you say and think to yourself about yourself. Self-image is really just in the background, right? You don't sit there and think consciously about the type of person you are or what your values are. Your self-image just exists. It's kind of part of you. It's just there, and it changes, and it morphs, and it is adjusted based on the things you consciously think. So here's pretty much the best technique I know to purposefully change it in regards to your shooting, and that is to focus on what you do right. Every time you go to the range to practice or compete, make note of what you do right and feast on it. The reciprocal of this is to not dwell on the things you do incorrectly. In fact, forget them. Forget your mistakes, feast on your successes. This technique is appropriately called feast and forget. Every time you shoot a 10 in practice or competition, you should look at it and say, yes, that was like me, it's like me to shoot 10s. Every time you shoot anything other than a 10, forget it. Make a slight adjustment if you need to, but that's it. Forget about what you did wrong and focus instead on what you need to do right in order to continue to shoot good shots. Another way of looking at it is to always take something positive away from your shooting, never anything negative. Do not get off the line after a match and say, I had a good first string, but, my last one was horrible. My trigger control was bad, my concentration was horrible, and I didn't follow through. By saying those things, you've just influenced your self-image in a negative way. Your self-image now sees you as someone more likely to have bad trigger control or more likely to have poor concentration and poor follow-through. This is, of course, the opposite of what you want. Everything you say to yourself has an impact on your self-image, which then translates into your performance. Instead, you should have gotten off the line and said, hey, I had an excellent first string. My hold was great, my triggering was great, and I called my shots well. Next time, I'm going to focus on continuing to have good trigger control and follow through throughout the match, and I'm going to make follow through a performance priority, and as a result, I will shoot even better than I did today. I've had excellent trigger control and follow through before, and I will make sure to have that again. So see, no negativity there, right? All positive thoughts. The only thing we did was build up our self-image to be more of a shooter with good technical abilities. Feast or forget, and never ever have negative self-talk. 2 of the most important ways to build your self-image. Another critical self-image principle is that your self-image is directly influenced not only by your own self-talk, but also what you hear from the people around you and what you say to the people around you. If you get off the line halfway through a match, or maybe if it's a 2-day match, you get off the line after day 1, and you're listening to a teammate or another shooter talking negatively about some aspect of their shooting, then leave. Get out of earshot. Just go away. Get it in your own space. You don't want to hear that. Just overhearing negativity like that is going to have an indirect effect on your own self-image. Surround yourself with people who talk positively about their shooting and their abilities, like we just discussed a minute ago, because not only will other people's negative talk about their shooting bring down your self-image, but other people's positive talk can bring yours up as well. And in fact, you speaking positively to someone else about their shooting is a good way to bring up your own as well. I know it's weird, but trust me, these things work. Self-image may seem kind of weird too, voodoo, not for real men who are impervious to this type of thing, magic, but it's real and it affects everyone. In order to perform like a champion, you need to have the self-image of a champion. No matter what your personal skill level and your technical abilities are, if you have a low self-image, you are never going to reach your goals in this sport. So now, hopefully, you're kind of starting to see what I mean when I say that your self-image is what is the biggest determining factor when it comes to how far you can go in this. Always be striving to build it up and be cautious of where it can break down. Final tip, don't be afraid to, lie to yourself a little bit. If you're not a great final shooter, just lie to yourself in your head. Say something along the lines of, like if you're about to go shoot a final, say something to yourself like, I'm a great final shooter. I always have great finals performances because I keep a cool head under pressure and I keep my shot process simple, and that enables me to shoot good quality shots and rise above the competition. Knowing what you know now about self-image, you shouldn't be surprised if you see yourself starting to shoot better in finals once you've been doing this for a while, because you know that the self-image drives you to perform in the way it sees you. Turns out that little lie you kept telling yourself isn't so much of a lie after all at this point. Take advantage of this aspect of your mental game, because it is a huge part of what will make you great as a shooter. Again, like last week, I urge you to go out and get Lanny Basham's book, With Winning in Mind, where you will be able to get a lot more detail on the topic of mental game for the shooting sports. The basis of what I've told you comes from what Lanny basically came up with, and it just focuses more on what's been most helpful to me, and I've presented it in the way that I think about them. Aside from that, again, please donate to the show if you're interested, as I explained at the beginning of the episode, and if you have any questions about anything we've covered so far, or have any suggestions for a future show on a topic that you'd like me to cover, please send an email to olympicshootingpodcast@gmail.com, and I will try to get back to you in short order. I hope you've enjoyed this Mental Game 101 series, and join us next week as we dive into a new topic. Talk to you then.